Hi, good afternoon, everybody, friends, family, and to the whole world, because we're on the internet. I am Hadley Bajramovic, Gringa, and I have with me as my co-host.
Zayra Ivette Padilla, La Chapina. Hello, everyone. Hola.
Hola, and today we have a special guest, Liani Santa Maria. Liani has worked with iLob since 2020. Liani, is that right?
That's correct, Hadley.
Okay, see, I don't remember that ever about anybody, so I'm proud of myself. How long people have been there. I just know that people start working and they become part of the family, and that's what I remember. And Liani, um, when she came to our office, we were so excited to have her because Liani um, is fluent in Spanish and she is also fluent in sign language. And our office has more than 300 deaf clients, which is a story in itself, how that happened and how we came to specialize in immigration for the deaf. So, Liani, I don't know if you feel like signing anything that we're talking about. Maybe, after I talk, you can talk about sign, or, well, Zayra explains everything in Spanish. But we just sit on this podcast and talk about things that happen in the office, and uh, hope that when we talk about our stories, that people learn from them. And what I guess everybody can learn from our deaf history, our immigration cases, is that when people are persecuted in their home country and they fear going back to their home country, they should apply for asylum. And what happened was we had one gentleman, Hector Figueroa. It's a very famous story. We talk about it all the time. We even have a nonprofit called the Hector Project. He approached me at an immigration rights rally at a local Catholic church and with a napkin that basically said, "Please help me." And nobody so far that Hector had met had thought about asylum. And I started to talk to him about his story, his wife's story, all of his friends in the community, their stories, and found out, that deaf people are persecuted in Latin America. And then we filed asylum cases. We got a lot of criticism for it. But, we're happy to say that all of the cases that we represented so far have had really good results: asylum, green cards, work authorization. So, that started in 2010 with Kathy Rockville. And now you've joined us. And I think what we can talk about first is in representing our deaf clients, we're usually starting with the USCIS and then very often moving to the immigration removal proceedings. And we noticed that the rights of deaf people are overlooked. We have to fight for interpreters. I think that's the number one thing. And our clients get into court and they're like, "Where's our interpreter?" And they think that we have control. I mean, we do. We file motions and let the courts know that our client's deaf. But beyond that, we don't have any control. But this is our number one problem when we go into legal forums with our deaf clients. So we've been, and maybe Leonie, you can talk about the ADA and why this shouldn't be happening and what our responsibility is as a law firm under the ADA.
Yeah, the ADA is really important. It was really stressed a lot about when I was going through my interpreting program, that it's accessibility for everybody, and that includes people who are hard of hearing and who are deaf. And that hasn't been. There's been a lot of cases that during my program where we see that, okay, well, we'd have different places. We'd have Spanish interpreters, Arabic interpreters, Chinese interpreters, but when it came to American Sign Language, it was kind of overlooked because it was kind of like, is that really a real language? People sometimes don't really kind of recognize it as a real language. In schools, they don't really recognize it. They're like, oh, well, the sign language is kind of a language, but it is a language. It was built like a language, it has linguistics just like a language. So it's an important tool that everyone needs accessibility, and the deaf clients especially, since there's no one to advocate for them but themselves, and wherever they go, they need that accessibility. So it's super important that they have accessibility. And so, as an interpreter, we are trained to be that facilitator of communication so that we are there when they need us. And so, having cases where they go to court and there's no interpreters, or there's a lack of interpreters who are well qualified, is also very hurts them as well. So it's a really bad, it's a hard rock and a hard place for them, because if they have a bad interpreter, they don't get their story told correctly, or if they don't have an interpreter at all, they basically have no voice. So we act as their interpreter, make sure that they facilitate. So I feel it's a super important role, just like any other language. And I'm really super passionate about it because it's something that I've kind of grown accustomed to and learned about, and had deaf teachers, and have had interactions with the deaf community outside of the office. So it's super important to be that advocate. And I know that when the deaf clients, they come in and there's new deaf clients, the first thing they ask is, they call through video relay service. And one of my favorite responses is that, oh, well, we have an interpreter here. We have interpreters here for you. So that's accessibility. And they're like, what? There's interpreters? There's interpreters for me? There's interpreters? Yeah, yes, there's interpreters here. So they find it really relieving. It's like, okay, I'm going to be able to tell my story and have a voice, and my interpreter is going to be able to interpret everything. And so I think it's like really unique that we have interpreters, in-house interpreters, and other places don't have that. So they have to request interpreters.
And I think that was one of the things that obviously was important, and since we started working with the deaf, that they saw that we wanted to help them, that we had an interpreter. Like you say, Lian, it's for them, it's surprising to find out that we had an interpreter, because we've heard other stories from different law firms that they never had an interpreter before until they came to the office, and then you really have an interpreter because the last attorney, like, I couldn't communicate with them and stuff, things like that. So it's very sad to hear that. And not all. I mean, imagine we hear that those stories about Spanish interpreters. So imagine having an ASL interpreter is even more difficult if somebody, they just don't even provide a Spanish, which is so common. So you see the accessibility of those of interpreting, and how important it is for just everyone to have access to that, to understand what's going on in their own language.
Yeah, and then we also have, additional things that we learned over time, you know, with the cases that we worked on, that even complicate the language and the accessibility further. And that is that most of our clients had no access to education. I mean, for a long time, I thought they did, because I would ask the question, did you go to school? And, their answer would be, yes, I did. And then, I don't know, it took me a year maybe, when we were digging in with declarations, maybe not a year, I don't know. But I mean, it took
Yeah,
me a long time to realize school was not what I thought school was. School was probably in a room with some kind of a babysitter giving them colors to play with. And then there's another scenario where they would be sent to mainstream hearing school, and sit at the front of the classroom, and that for some reason the teachers thought if they sat at the front of the classroom, somehow they would hear. And then we would hear about the abusive ways the teachers would try to get them to talk, including violence, some weird stories about putting birds down their throats. I mean, just crazy stuff. And that's part of the persecution. So We know that very often people try to communicate with our clients in writing, and they can't do that. They can't write in Spanish. I mean, they could probably pick out a few words, but they don't know if it's past, present tense. I mean, they don't really have concrete language most of the time when they're coming from Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Liani, have you had to adjust or figure out ways to communicate with our clients, compared to what you learned in school?
Definitely. There's a lot more discrepancy when when you use sign language. You can tell when there's a native language user and
Mm-hmm.
someone who had to kind of adjust to that language here. So it's very different. It's very different. There's the native language, they're able to kind of sign faster, they're able to be more fluent, and then the non-native speakers, well, non-native signers are more, they're a little bit more slow, but they still get that message across. And then the big thing that is really important is that some of them don't know ASL and they know LSM, which is Mexican Sign Language. So they think, oh well, it's a universal language. Sign language is everywhere. You'll use, but it's not. Every different country, every different region has their own sign language. So it's kind of having to adjust and kind of knowing when to use what signs and maybe not using specific signs and maybe kind of explaining it out, making it more expansive. So it's kind of learning and then having help from Kathy is having her take me under her wing and kind of learn a little bit of how she signs things, how she explains things. It's been really helpful to be able to help get better access for everybody to get for the deaf clients.
Yeah, I was thinking about how Kathy would try to establish timelines with our clients. A lot of them came in the late 90s. So when we were trying to figure out what year they arrived, because most of them didn't know exactly, she started
Mm-hmm.
using the 9/11 sign, which is something like it looks like an airplane flying into a tower. How does it, Leona, can you do the 9/11 sign?
From what I've seen people sign it like the 9/11, like the date, like
Right.
September
Mm-hmm.
11th, and I say like the towers, like the twin, and that kind of just describe it, the full buildings of plane.
And then the
Mm-hmm.
plane,
Very
that's,
visual in like the
Mm-hmm.
crash, the collision. So they're very visual. So sign language is super visual.
Mm-hmm.
So if you set up 9/11, they'll be like, oh, they'll describe to you the exact how the scenario, how the placements of the buildings and the location where the plane crashed. It's a very expressive language, which is super like interesting to kind of just like visually see.
yeah.
It's
And
And
wow.
that
also very
expressive,
descriptive too.
mm-hmm. Yeah, like when they describe fear, they go like this, and that
Mm-hmm.
makes them very effective witnesses. I sat through probably 100 asylum interviews with our clients, telling their stories in sign language, and it's enthralling to watch them sign, their
Mm-hmm.
story. And I don't, I know a few words in sign language, but I knew what they were talking about just by their faces and that kind of emotion in their faces when they were telling what happened to them in those interviews.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I remember that they will come to the office, and I used to be able to understand more signing because of being on the constant interaction with our deaf, and they'll ask for me, and they're like, they swore I signed, and obviously I don't sign, but I was able to do it because I speak Spanish, so we're very expressive too when it comes to, like, our we use a lot of our hands or like face and stuff like that. So I think that helped too, because I noticed that the Mexican Sign Language, I was able to recognize more of their signing because we use it too in Spanish. Um, but yeah, they were like, Zaira, we need to speak to Zaira. And then I will come out, and like nobody would know what they're talking about. So I will come out, and I was able to understand them, but I wouldn't be able to sign back. Very limited, applying, or, immigration court and stuff like that. And so it was just very limited, like specific terms that I was able to sign with them, and and that's pretty much all I needed, because of it was very specific what they wanted. They wanted their EAT, their red card, and things like that. So it was, I really enjoyed, when the deaf clients will come and ask for me, because I was the one that was able to communicate with them, and I was just like, oh my god, let me see if I can, and I'll go out and sign with them. But
And that's
yeah.
why it was great to have Leonie, you know, come and say, I'd like to work here and be at the front desk. And, our deaf clients do walk in without, appointments. And Leonie's been there now for 4 years to help with the issues that come up. And we have to help them with a lot more than immigration, and because they have good problems. Before, they were living literally in the shadows without being able
Hmm.
to hear, and now they have the ability to work. So we've had to teach them about filing taxes, about bank accounts, but it's all been worth it when we see how our clients have become, managers and in Walgreens and Amazon, and their children are going to Gallaudet University.
And
Sorry,
actually
Zara.
applying for a job, filling out an application,
Yeah.
because many of them, they didn't have a job, a formal job, because they were just out on the street trying to survive. So that was really nice. Kathy, our interpreter, spent hours and hours helping them in the library to complete applications. I guess, para nosotros en la oficina ha sido sumamente importante nuestros clientes sordos. Platicábamos con Liani, ¿verdad? Que ella tiene la fortuna de saber 3 idiomas: español fluido, idioma de señas y también obviamente inglés. Así que tiene 3 mundos totalmente abiertos a ella, y por eso fue una gran bendición que ella viniera a nuestra oficina, además de tener nuestra intérprete Katy. Liana ha sido muy importante en la oficina, porque ella estuvo mucho tiempo de recepcionista, así que ella podía ver a nuestros clientes sordos cuando venían, directamente se comunicaban con ella, así que eso fue algo muy agradable para ellos, tener a alguien inmediatamente que les pudiera ayudar, porque antes yo con mis señas bien limitadas, me comunicaba con ellos, pero era casi nada. Pero de acuerdo a ellos, yo sabía el idioma de señas, pero yo les entendía, pero realmente pues quise aprender idiomas de señas, y ahora pienso de que si hubiera tomado en ese tiempo en el colegio idioma de señas, pues hubiera sido una gran ventaja para mí, pero no es que no quise, sino nunca hubo cupo. Entonces no tomé la oportunidad de aprender idiomas de señas, pero ahora hubiera sido una gran ventaja para mí hacerlo. Pero sabemos lo limitado que están ellos también. O sea, sabemos de muchos grupos en la comunidad migrante que tienen muchísimas limitaciones, pero nuestros clientes sordos tienen muchísimas más todavía, porque ellos básicamente se están cerrados del resto del mundo. Entonces, es algo tan importante por nosotros poderlos ayudar, representarlos y tener una voz para ellos. Hablábamos de lo difícil que es en el ámbito migratorio en general para todas las personas, pero más todavía para nuestros clientes sordos. Así que ha sido un motivo muy grande en nuestro despacho poder ayudar a nuestros clientes inmigrantes sordos, que sabemos que, como Liani sabe, ¿verdad? Ella puede hablar sobre esto, de que vienen de sufrir abusos extremos en sus países de origen. Tristemente, no en el ámbito de público, sino en sus propias casas han sido abusados seriamente, o los tienen como sirvientes, como alguien que solo, entre comillas, sirve para ese tipo de trabajo. No, nunca tienen una educación. Supuestamente van a la escuela, pero los tienen con personas que tienen diferentes incapacidades. y realmente nunca aprendieron un idioma en sí. Se comunicaron por medio de señas de la casa que ellos mismos entre la familia crearon, pero realmente nunca aprendieron un idioma. Tuvimos una clienta que hasta los 18 años supo cómo se llamaba. Así tan triste es la realidad de nuestros clientes sordos. La mayoría han sufrido abusos extremadamente incomprensibles, porque podemos decir una persona sorda no físicamente no sabes que tiene esa incapacidad, ¿verdad? Hasta que ya te dice, soy sordo, entonces ya obviamente sabes que esta persona es sorda, pero así físicamente no, nunca notarías que esta persona tiene esta incapacidad auditiva. Entonces es todavía más difícil para muchas personas y por eso se toman partido de esas personas que quieren abusar de ellos, tomar partido de ellos. Y por eso en nuestro despacho tomamos tan en serio a nuestros clientes sordos, ayudarlos a ellos. Y pues, Eliani, no sé si querés hablar un poco sobre tu experiencia con nuestros clientes, el hecho que cómo te puedes comunicar con ellos, te puedes comunicar con ellos y su reacción, ¿verdad? De tener a alguien que directamente ellos tengan esa oportunidad de comunicarse directamente en vez de esperar que los llamen o que se comuniquen después.
Yeah, it's been fun, but having the iPad ring and right away answer, they're like, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you." And I'm like, "Yes, I'm here. How can I help you?" So it's been a really wonderful experience being able to interact and kind of getting to know each person, each client to kind of like, oh, I know who's calling just by the number itself. I'm getting to Kathy's level almost there.
Yeah, I think what we have done as far as pioneering is we've taken the time to work with really experienced people in the field of interpreting, and also worked with Dr. Rachel Mayberry at University California San Diego, who did a lot of studies on the cognitive effects of lack of language at a certain age, which is what most of our clients have afflicting, memory and other things that allowed us to declare asylum. And so working with people where we've been able to get really great detailed declarations that talk about the persecution and fighting for ASL and certified deaf interpreters in court. Because I can tell you that when I went to court the first time with our deaf clients, the judge said, well, I can see that this is a social group that we can tell they're deaf by they're using the sign, which people can't do in Mexico, by the way, because if they sign in Mexico, then they become targets immediately. But the judges would ask, how do we prove persecution? I don't see the nexus between deafness and persecution. And through sign language interpreters that work hard to get the story out in the CDIs, we've been able to tell the stories in the courts. And also reminding the courts nicely that they must have an ASL interpreter, CDI, and sometimes Mexican Sign Language. We've had some lengthy relays where there's been an ASL interpreter talking to a Mexican Sign Language interpreter and a CDI where the conversation goes through four people and then finally verbalized to a judge. That's how it works sometimes. I'll let you
And
guys talk about that.
yeah, and I think 100% of our clients need a CTI, and because they just we want to make sure that everything it's relayed properly and it's it's interpreted correctly. And many times they're like, oh, it's an ASL, and we're like, no, we need a CDI because they need it because most of them grew up without a language, so they really need two interpreters, not just one, but two. And like you say, many of them also sign, which is Hector. He signs, his first language was Mexican sign. So he needed somebody who really could, understand what he was talking about. So, many times the clients get frustrated because they're like, I need an interpreter. We're like, we know, but the court is taking their sweet time to get one, and they have to fly from like New York, Hadley? No,
Texas.
Seattle and Chicago, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we commonly work with a CDI who I think lives in Seattle, and then an ASL interpreter who's in Texas. They've been working with us,
Oh,
since
Texas, yes.
2011. Yeah, I mean they're the ones that come to the asylum interviews and to the court. Usually the same people, and I think it's good they're using the same people because they seem to have developed an ability to communicate. Like the planes flying into the towers, right? I mean, like Liani, tell us in your opinion, how does the CDI improve the interpreting?
That was super like vastly improved. So as an interpreter, we're hearing. So I can only interpret to such a point where it's more English based, where it's trying my best to get it all into pure sign language. But a CDI, certified deaf interpreter, they're deaf. So the sign language that I do, they make it much more sign language. If I explain 9/11, they'll go into depth, and then the deaf client is able to understand it better. Is okay, there's a clearer picture. I hear what they're saying. I'll get it to the deaf interpreter. The deaf interpreter gives it to the client, and we're just relaying it back and forth. And I've actually got to work with a certified deaf interpreter before, and it is really cool because it's just they sign it, I sign it to them, they sign it back, and it's such more depth, much more, it's just more detailed. It's incredible. I'm like, okay, I'm not at that level, I'm not at that, oh, that's another level. But it's been really fun. I also got to work with a deaf interpreter that did Mexican Sign Language, which was really amazing too. I was like trying to pay attention to the, okay, I'm in interpreter mode, I got this. But I also was part of that student in me was just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Like, wow, it's a whole different language. It's a whole, like, oh, I know that sign. Like, oh, that sign is like, that's that sign. So it's kind of like, it's an experience being able to kind of work with them and being able to provide that more accessibility. It's more accessibility. It's just like if someone having a doctor who speaks English and has a Spanish interpreter, it's kind of like having a doctor who speaks Spanish talking to a Spanish client. It's like, okay, more accessibility. I don't need a third party. This is great. Like I can have someone who understands me. Like it's a big emphasis
Yeah,
on understanding.
and it's interesting because our clients sometimes will just nod and agree and act like they understand because it's been too hard for them to get that kind of access to communication, like having a CDI. And we found out so much in the interviews when we had a CDI. I mean, we don't have the resources to have a CDI here all day long. But I remember one of our clients was in the asylum interview, and the asylum officer asked her, "Have you been to any other countries?" And, our client just did their normal reaction that they knew to do. Like, they just said no because that just sounded like the right thing to say, no. And then our client, like 10 seconds later, said, what are countries? And, the officer, all of us were just like, we just were like, oh, wow. We are assuming so much here about what this person is thinking or knowing. So the officer went up to a map and showed the client or the applicant countries, still was like, oh, I don't understand that picture. They're different colors and, squiggly lines. And then we, after that, took a lot of time with everybody to see if they understood countries. Geographic border makes no sense to most of our clients.
And
Basically, they would tell us our like where there's trash and where there's no trash.
yeah, I was
That's
gonna
how
say
they would,
that.
yeah, that's how
Uh-huh.
they would describe a border. Like, yeah, there was trash. Then I walked 5 minutes, and then there's no trash. That's when we assume they entered the U.S. from
Yeah, and
Tijuana.
we've been blessed to work with a lot of also advocates and people who are really making a change, especially in Mexico, because we're just neighbors, we're next to each other, and we know we work with Edgar Sanabria, who's a pretty much the only known interpreter in Mexico of
Yeah,
Mexican Sign Language. He also signs ASL, and then also we work with Los Ojos de Joan. Hadley, remember that he was the one that pushed for to have more access to people, not only deaf people but blind people too, to have signs in braille. And so it's just for us it's so important to really expand and like not only make a difference here in the States but go to other countries that there's a lot of people who are also really trying hard to have for different minority groups with disabilities to have access to a normal life and to go out and be able to do things like that. So that's another, like Hadley said, we work with Dr. Mayberry, and so, and we also have been able to work with other people in Mexico too, who have been very important in the deaf culture, and really pushing for their rights and having accessibility. So that's
Yeah,
another thing that we.
we even met with the Minister of Human Rights when there was a changeover in administration. This was the president before AMLO, and we went and discussed what deaf access looked like in Mexico. And she told us, I admit it, we're failing. We don't have an education system. We don't have laws with teeth in them that protect people have hearing, um, uh, hard of hearing. And I'm trying really hard not to say disability because it's not really a disability, right? It's just like a culture, a lifestyle, deaf world, deaf culture.
It's a
Mhm.
And
different world.
we continue to meet with people down there. I went down there with Dr. Danny Blair a summer ago to see how we could start teaching ASL, through Zoom and other ways to give more access to language, as we've learned about the situation through the asylum seekers. They're teaching society and people like Danny Blair, who's at California Baptist University, about what is going on. And this is part of our long-standing commitment to serving the most vulnerable populations wherever we can serve. Here, Mexico, Guatemala, doesn't matter.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Yanni.
Oh no, I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay.
No,
So
pass it to
yeah,
the
it's, I
Frankfurt.
mean, we can spend so much time talking about this, y sabemos lo importante que es para nosotros compartirles esta experiencia que hemos tenido con nuestra comunidad sorda, que es tan importante para nosotros en nuestra oficina. Tenemos más de 300 clientes sordos y seguimos obviamente trabajando, esforzándonos de expandir este tipo de información, de dar voz al que no tiene, que es tan importante para nosotros en el despacho. Y por eso le agradecemos mucho que nos escucharan hoy. Gracias, Leani, por hablar de tu experiencia. Y pues seguiremos trabajando con los diferentes grupos, no solo con nuestros clientes sordos, pero tantos grupos que existen en nuestra comunidad inmigrante en este país. Así que seguiremos luchando poco a poco. Yo sé que sabemos que es algo difícil y que no es algo fácil de ayudar a grupos específicos que son vulnerables y que necesitan tanta ayuda, pero para eso estamos y por eso que nos esforzamos cada día más en ayudar a los que más lo necesitan, que es algo importante para nosotros. Así que gracias, Leani. Nos despedimos. Quisiéramos seguir platicando, pero el tiempo apremia, como decimos, así que gracias a todos por escucharnos. Espero que les haya gustado esta plática sobre nuestra comunidad sorda migrante en este país. Gracias, se despide ustedes, Zayra Ivette Padilla, la Chapina. Saludos desde Chapinlandia.
And for me, bye from Hadley La Gringa. And thank you, Leonie. Leonie, what is your sign name?
Oh, my signing is Lily. I had to shorten it because my name was the deaf
It was
client.
hard.
Shocked. They said, "Who gave you that?" I was like, "My parents." I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's not
And
important to me.
That sounds like something.
thank you. Mine is
Thank,
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye, everybody.